Okay, good afternoon and welcome to PNP Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine. And we're very pleased to have with us this afternoon Professor Steven Pinker, here to talk about his new book, Rationality, what it is, why it seems scarce, and why it matters. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of Rationality. Right at the start of his book, Steve notes the predicament we're in. Namely, we live in crazy times filled with fake news, quack cures, conspiracy theories, and post-truth rhetoric. I mean, it used to be that the big challenge was coming up with hard-to-find solutions to difficult things. Now inventing the solution is easier, it seems, than persuading people to accept it. So what should we do about that? Well, the first thing to do is to read Steve's book, Rationality, which grew out of a course he taught at Harvard, where he's been a professor of psychology for nearly 2 decades. He's a big believer in the tools of reasoning for helping us get through life. Tools such as logic, critical thinking, probability, correlation, and causation. And as anyone familiar with his previous popular books know, Steve has a knack for making scientific and technical subjects accessible and engaging. Early on in his academic career, he wrote 2 technical books, but for the past 2.5 decades or so, his books have been aimed at general audiences. Most of those works have dealt with aspects of psycholinguistics and cognitive science, his specialty fields. Books have won numerous prizes. 2 were Pulitzer Prize finalists, and he's garnered awards from a number of professional groups and been widely recognized as an influential voice in discussions of science and society. Conversation with Steve this afternoon will be Dacher Keltner, professor of psychology at Berkeley, where he directs the Berkeley Social Interaction Lab. He's also the founder and faculty director of the Greater Good Science Center, and host of the podcast, The Science of Happiness. And he's a bestseller author too. So Steve and Dacher, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad. Good to see you, Steve.
Nice to see you, Dacher. Thanks for agreeing to have this conversation.
Yeah, so I want to just express some gratitude out here from Berkeley, California. I'm not that much younger than you, but when I read Language Instinct and Blank Slate, it was an epiphany just to know that our science can be translated to the kind of prose that you produce. So thanks for paving the way and showing us what we can do with the written word. It was real pleasure. And I felt the same about reading Rationality, and what I'm hoping to do in our 40 minutes or so together, and then invite questions from the audience in the Q&A in our last 15 minutes, is just kind of work through some of the big implications of this book. And Brad talked a bit about your inspiration for, you taught the course on Rationality, and I'm curious, why take on this big theme in the way that you do, which we'll get to right now? What inspired you?
Partly, it's like a lot of psychologists, I've always enjoyed teaching the work from our field on the common biases and fallacies and cognitive illusions, the work made famous by Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman. And the flip side of that are the kinds of models of how we ought to reason, the normative models, like Bayesian reasoning and probability and logic, that we often use in our everyday work, and that I tend to think everyone should master, just part of being an educated person, that you have some sense of what, how to calibrate your beliefs according to evidence. The fancy name is Bayesian reasoning, but it's just something that we always do, and we should do it better. But the immediate impetus was some students approaching me, asking if I would teach a course in effective altruism. Now, this is the movement to try to allocate philanthropic volunteering and donations where they do the most good, to try to quantify how many lives your dollar will save, how much clean water will it deliver, how many cases of malaria will it prevent, so that people could do their gooding, they're do-gooders, and for more good to be done. But it was a little too, and of course, this is a topic you've given a lot of thought to, but I thought that just effective altruism was too narrow for a semester-long course that I'd be willing to teach. But it was an example of how we have applied rationality in domains that formerly were just governed by intuition and hunches. So in charitable giving, it was the warm glow. You and I both know Michael Lewis, the author of Moneyball, who talked about how baseball and other sports have been revolutionized by statistical analyses. We have evidence-based medicine. We've got data-driven policing. We have feedback-informed psychotherapy. So there's domain after domain where we seem to be getting more rational, which makes all the more acute the paradox of why do we also seem to be losing our mind? How can we get so smart in doing baseball more rationally, but so stark raving mad in our politics and our medicine and so much else? So that was the tension. And then as a psychologist, of course, it was a great challenge. How can one brain house such amazingly rational capabilities, but also the ability to entertain so much flapdoodle and codswallop?
We are a bundle of contradictions, to say the least. So I want to start then by defining rationality, and it's a tough thing to define, right? It can be many different things depending on the discipline. It can be about the cogence of your beliefs. It can be the sense that you're using more deliberative reasoning processes. Tell us what your definition of rationality is, and let's see what we make of it.
Well, one of the reasons that it's so hard to pin down is that rationality is always in pursuit of some goal. And in fact, I define rationality as the use of knowledge to attain a goal. Now, that goal could be objective truth, but it may not be. And so we get the multiplicity of varieties of rationality in action.
Yeah. So in my class, I teach a lot of, like you, and been inspired by Charles Darwin and the developments in evolutionary thinking for the past 150, 60 years since Darwin. And I bump into this interesting kind of tension with respect to rationality, which is that I'll present the arguments of the evolution of altruism or kindness or whatever the case may be. And I'll have an intelligent designer who comes in and has, a set of beliefs that fit your definition of rationality, right? Which is they are justifying things they believe to be true that serves goals in their lives in the world. How do we sort this out?
Yeah, well, in the case of belief in creationism, it kind of lays bare some of the what you and I would recognize as a kind of irrationality, though they are deploying their rational faculties. And indeed, studies of why people reject the evolution of humans, why they become creationists, have shown that contrary to the belief of most scientists, it's not that they're scientifically ignorant or scientifically illiterate. And in fact, if you just take out questions like, did humans evolve from apes, which is kind of triggers people, it's a hot button. But if you take those particular questions out, turns out there's no difference in scientific literacy or sophistication between typical creationists and typical believers. What does differ is their politics. The farther to the right, the more they're creationists. And it shows that one of the things that we deploy our rationality to is to ratify the beliefs of our tribe, our coalition, our sect. And if you belong to a Christian-oriented community where it's kind of a test of your faith, of your loyalty to your community that you believe in creationism, then all of your rational faculties will be directed at showing that that's right. Whereas if you have a more kind of secular liberal community, then who accepts evolution, that's where you'll deploy your faculties. And it doesn't mean that in reality it's a toss-up. Oh, creationism, Darwin, it's all a matter of what tribe you believe in. I mean, I really do think there are arguments why, in fact, creationism is wrong, but the vast majority of people don't align don't ground their beliefs in those arguments. It's what gets them prestige and status within their community.
Right. So I want to walk through, and one of the really interesting experiences in reading this book, like a lot of your books, Steve, is the discipline that you represent, whether it's linguistics and the language instinct in some of your other books, or kind of the new studies of the design of the human organism in Blank Slate. You start to kind of see the world through the discipline that you're covering. And in this case, I want to draw our audience's attention to the ambition of this book. And it's something I've never seen before, which is you're bringing together a couple hundred years and more recently 50, 60 years of attempts to model rationality with different local theories, right? So you've got prospect theory of Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky, and game theory and prisoner's dilemma games, and logic and probability and statistical reasoning. We bring them all together, and as you said at the outset, what's at stake here, and I want Steve Pinker's guidance is, here's what a model says we should do, the normative model, and then here's what crazy humans do in practice. So let's start with logic, and let's just think, how should we be good logicians? And then sadly, what do humans do?
Yeah, so logic is, Mr. Spock in Star Trek said it's really annoying to work with humans because they're so illogical. He's kind of equating logic and rationality, and they're not the same thing. And that's one of the reasons why I defined rationality, not as logic, but the use of knowledge in pursuit of a goal. In logic, the goal is to deduce true propositions from old ones. That's a very useful thing to do, but it's not all there is to rationalize. So Xanthippe, all women are mortal. Xanthippe is a woman, therefore Xanthippe is mortal. A syllogistic deduction, kind of a paradigm case. And it is useful to know the basics of logic so as not to commit formal fallacies like affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent, such as all creative geniuses were laughed at in their time. People laugh at my ideas, therefore I'm a creative genius.
I was counting on that one.
So that's an example of a logical fallacy. And it's good to know them. It's good to know what really doesn't follow from what. But the thing is that logic is only part of reason, because it only works when the premises are known to be true, when you're talking about things that are categorically true or categorically false, that they're binary, and you restrict your reasoning to just what's stated in those propositions. You don't bring in all of your background knowledge. Now, in fact, in everyday life, that's kind of irrational, but it can be logical. And that's the difference between them. In real life, it never makes sense to forget everything you know except like 2 sentences on a page. But that's what we do when we apply logic. And the famous Russian psychologist Salvador Luria noted when he interviewed Russian peasant farmers that a lot of their responses would be utter failures on any test of academic intelligence, but were perfectly reasonable. Like if you ask a peasant, what do a fish and a crow have in common? Typical answer is absolutely nothing. A fish lives in the water, a crow flies. A crow can eat a fish can't eat a crow. Now, of course, you and I, with kind of a scientific mindset, would say, well, they're both vertebrates, they're both living things, they're both animals. An answer that kind of makes no difference to how you live your life. It does make a difference if you think of the world scientifically. And so it draws in the contrast between sometimes called ecological rationality, namely what is actually serviceable and useful as you live your life, as opposed to what strictly fits a set of definitions and rules of inference.
Right. And wonderful expose. So that brings us to kind of our next piece of rationality, and which is probability. And things are probabilistic, and we're trying to figure out the likelihood of events, from a world of possibility. So tell us what we should really be, how we should approach the world probabilistically, and then where we go wrong.
Well, the big contrast in probability, probabilistic thinking, is between the classic definition of probability, which is number of occurrences divided by number of opportunities, and the typical way in which we intuitively sense probability, identified by Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman as the availability heuristic, which is the more easily you can think of an example, the more probable you think it is. The problem, so you use kind of the search engine in your brain as a way of doing probability. The higher it is in the results list, the likelier it is. Now, the problem, of course, is that lots of things determine how available an anecdote or a narrative is, other than how often it occurs in the world, such as, are the newspapers likely to cover it? And so people vastly overestimate shark attacks and terrorist attacks and school shootings because they're so gaudy and photogenic and you can't turn your head away. But in fact, what's much more likely to kill you is falling off a ladder, getting into a car crash, fighting over a parking spot, to say nothing of emphysema from air pollution and heart attacks and cancer.
Yeah. You know, as I was reading Rationality, one of the things that kept coming to mind, and I'm going to challenge you on this a bit, is like, what would Steve Pinker's CNN look like, right? What would you actually...
I've actually given that some thought.
Oh, yeah, let's hear it.
So, CNN might be hopeless, but in the papers, or in the news sites, there's a big contrast between the way they present the news, which is something gaudy or gory or photogenic that happened this morning, and the way they cover business and sports and weather, where they present graphs and tables and data every single day. So they don't just, the sports page, you'd be very upset if the only thing they covered was when there was like a blowout or a shutout, and the boring, 1-point games or ties were just considered, or if they didn't print the standings. Same with business. You can follow the commodities and the futures and the bond prices every single day. So I think that the news, obviously, the business model can't be just present graphs and data, but something more like accompanying the news with a kind of dashboard. That is, what is the homicide rate? What's the rate of carbon emissions? What are the number of people in wars? What's the rates of violence against women and minorities? And to present any particular event in the context of the statistical background. How many people die from this in this kind of violence, and has it been going up or down? Just the habit of presenting trends and context, and not just single anecdotes, would go a long way, I think, toward aligning our understanding of the world with reality. Something that journalism, I think, systematically fails at, not for any of the nefarious reasons of they're biased this way, they're biased that way. It's kind of what news is. News is stuff that happens, and it happens suddenly. Whereas a lot of what shapes the world are either things that don't happen, like you look at the data and you realize, hey, there are a lot fewer wars than there used to be. But that's not a headline unless you count, or things that build up a few percentage points a year, but they never happen on a Thursday in October. So Max Rosa, the proprietor of Our World in Data, maybe that's what my CNN would look like, which is wonderful, but maybe a bad business model. But Max Rosa pointed out that the papers could have had the headline, 137,000 people escaped from extreme poverty yesterday, every day for the last 30 years. They never ran that headline. And so 1 billion people escaped from extreme poverty and no one knows about it. So, granted, human nature being what it is, people aren't just going to read the daily graph. But some greater statistical concept and attention to trends, I think, would be helpful.
Yeah, I hear you. And it's so interesting. I love your commentary about people love sports statistics and base rates and so forth. People love weather and it's data rich and so forth. People love the business, but there are certain realms where we seem to be resistant to rationality, which we'll sort of end our conversation on. Third piece of rationality is something that you hear a lot about today. It's kind of trendy, people talking about priors and this Reverend Bayes, and then of course Amos Tversky and Danny Kahneman's famous work on base rate neglect and the like. This one's really profound and very timely. Give us a kind of a quick description of what you make of Bayes' theorem and its relevance today.
Yeah, it is it sounds harder than it is, because you can ground it in common sense. This is the formula from the Reverend Thomas Bayes, basically a kind of a deduction from the nature of conditional probability on how you should adjust your degree of belief, your credence in a hypothesis, depending on evidence. So the idea is you don't just believe something or disbelieve it. You assign it a number between 0 and 1. Then when you're faced with new evidence, you evaluate it just according to 3 things. One of them is, how plausible was it before you even looked at the data, the priors? And you're right, that has kind of escaped from the world of statistics into everyday conversation. And the rate of mention of the word priors has gone up, a kind of an influence of academia on everyday conversation. So that's the priors. How, given everything we know up to this point, what is our belief in the hypothesis? Then there's the likelihood. If the hypothesis is true, what are the chances that you'd be seeing what you'd be seeing? And then how common is that evidence across the board?
Yeah.
Whether the hypothesis is true or it's false. They're just three quantities. We mentally combine them depending on how the problem is presented to us. We can combine them, but often we don't. We, as Tversky and Kahneman indicated, we kind of forget the base rate, the prior, and we just think of the stereotype. So an example is, imagine that Penelope is very artistic, and she writes sonnets, and she spends her summers in Italy. What are the chances that she is a psychology major? What are the chances that she's an art history major?
Yeah.
Now, most people say she's probably an art history major. Now, there are probably 500 psychology majors for every art history major. So no matter how artistic she is, chances are it's likely that she's a psychology major. But that statistic just doesn't occur to people. They reason from the stereotype, and they throw out the priors.
Yeah, I want to ask you, and humans neglect base rates, and we don't pay attention to broad prevalences or frequencies, and I'm curious your thoughts about this. At the end of when I teach human happiness at UC Berkeley, 500 people, I end frankly, and this isn't just to flatter, but I end with better angels of our nature, that we are making progress. There is a lot of social progress that are just basic base rates of our political and historical structure, right? Women are rising in power, people of color are rising in power. Of course, there's mass incarceration, but things are changing. Violence is decreasing. These are base rates that are out in the world, and I hit resistance, and I'm like, why do these broad swaths of data not convince people, or they feel reluctant? How do we make base rates more exciting? I think it's a serious problem.
It's a big challenge. Well, partly there's just the sheer incredulity coming from the availability, heuristic and availability loss. If every terrorist attack gets wall-to-wall coverage, if every rampage shooting, and someone says, oh, by the way, the rate of violence is going down, it just seems to defy your eyeballs. And again, that goes back to one of the kind of systemic problems with journalism, is that the events really have a powerful psychological effect, but one that misaligns people from the bigger picture of what's happening in the world. So the sheer incredulity. There's also a kind of moral psychology that a lot of people to concentrate on what's going right seems kind of callous or indifferent or supporting the status quo. Whereas pointing to the remaining suffering and injustice seems to be more morally enlightened. There is something to it. We don't want to, knowing the trends does not mean being complacent.
Of course.
And the argument to make are quite the contrary, that a lot of people seeing the climate and crime and terrorism just kind of throw up their hands and say it's naive to think that we can make anything better, so why even try? Let's just enjoy ourselves. Or some of them say, well, the system is so rotten and corrupt that we should just burn it all, and anything that rises out of the ashes is bound to be better, which could be, I think, a very dangerous political stance. And and ironically, it kind of unites some of the nihilistic right and the nihilistic left. If you really think that nothing that we have tried has actually made anything any better, then there is this funny convergence. Ronald Reagan famously said some years ago he declared war on poverty, and poverty won. Now, for Reagan, this was his attack on government programs. For other people, it's an attack on capitalism. The fact is that a lot of measures of poverty, when they take into account government transfers, so the poverty has decreased. The war on poverty, wasn't an utter victory, but it did much more good than harm. And if you don't realize that, then you're going to be cynical about the kind of actions that governments can take that really do make a difference. Now, they don't solve the problem in one fell swoop, but they do make people's lives better.
And I think, it was interesting, just, we're all worried right now. The past 5 years have seen, the drop political scientists are showing, and, the risks of democracy, the rise of authoritarianism, and this questioning of truth that the that's part of this political atmosphere is really worth considering. So maybe we can take it up in the Q&A in 15, 20 minutes. So I'm getting a sense of your view of rationality, and I want to encourage our audience. What a delightful treatment of all the advances across the social behavioral sciences that you really bring into one umbrella. Is really, I've taught game theory and prospect theory and probability and statistical and you've got it right there, which is kind of a real service to our field. But I want to ask you about a couple of things whose place I'm wondering in your view of rationality. And the first is passion or emotion.
Yeah.
You know, there's this long-standing, you cite David Hume, throughout, a wonderful thinker. There are a lot of reasons to think that passions are both irrational but have deep reasons to them, right? What's your take? What do you think? What about these system one layers to the human mind that evolution has bequeathed us for millions of years? What do you make of them?
Yeah, so there is a kind of rationality that's built into a lot of our pattern matching, our intuitions, where we can't actually reason step by step from premises to a conclusion. But our intuition combines probably a lifetime of experience of hundreds or thousands of kind of probabilistic cues, each one of which kind of goes together that tilt us toward one answer or another. In cases where we can apply algorithms, formulas, logic, it's often better to override those first impressions. But sometimes the first impressions do better than our best artificial intelligence models trying to reason them through step by step. More generally, the passions are, and I think when David Hume said reason must be a slave to the passions, I don't think he meant no one's capable of controlling their impulses. We're doomed to just shooting from the hip and living for the moment. And what I think he meant is that ultimately, it's another way of, I think, of stating what the way I define rationality as the use of knowledge to pursue a goal, where the goal comes from the passions. No one can logically tell you what is desirable, what is undesirable. There's no disputing tastes. And so at the end of the day, what you're using your rationality to attain depends on your passions. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing that reason and emotion should not be considered to be opposite, in the sense that this is a question I sometimes get. Well, are you saying that it's, isn't it irrational to fall in love? Isn't it irrational to appreciate a landscape? Well, no, it's not irrational. I mean, there's no logical argument for why you should appreciate a landscape. But if you do appreciate your natural beauty, rationality is relevant to how not to destroy it, how to get to see it, how to get to enjoy it the most. Likewise for things that give us deep satisfaction, like our relationships.
Yeah, well, and I love your discussion and its relation. Robert Frank, the economist, wrote really nicely about passions within reason. Same idea, and I think that the science of emotion, which I've been part of, is arriving at this idea of emotions have these deep goals and frames within them. All right.
If I could expand on that, because you brought up a wonderful book by Robert Frank.
Yeah.
Based on ideas originally from Thomas Schelling. There is another sense I didn't mention of how passion and reason can actually be intentional, which is in situations of bargaining, there can be a kind of a paradoxical advantage to irrationality. Namely, the other guy can't game you, can't predict you. If you're stubborn, if you're impervious to reason, sometimes you win. The most dramatic example is in the game of chicken, where if the two teenagers approaching each other at high speed, and the first one to swerve loses face, he's the chicken. Well, how do you win at chicken? Well, if you put a lock on your steering wheel and a brick on the gas pedal and climb into the back seat, that's kind of an irrational thing to do, but you'll win because the other guy, valuing his own life, will certainly swerve first. The reason these paradoxical tactics are not, in general, a wise way to live your life is, for one thing, if the other guy tries it at the same time, then you could be in big trouble. And the other reason is if you're just a hothead, the kind of high maintenance person that just can't be reasoned with, then other people might bail out. They might say, like, I'm going to deal with someone more reasonable.
Yeah, well put. And it was so great to see the citation of Thomas Schelling, Strategies of Conflict. Is a really influential book. So the second question that I had about this view of rationality, And it's very timely today, right? This is coming from Washington, D.C. We're close to the pizza restaurant where there was Pizzagate.
Comet Ping Pong Pizzeria.
That's right. And we're all worried about conspiracy theories and stories of this kind. And how do you juxtapose your thinking about rationality with this other powerful force that a lot of great thinkers from Jerome Bruner on have placed alongside data and scientific reasoning, which is fiction and narrative and story and deep part of our human nature? How do you look at this tension in our society today of the stories that are out there and the data that are another way of looking at the world?
Well, stories are certainly can be part of rationality. And in fact, one hypothesis as to why we are storytelling in animals is that stories are what philosophers call thought experiments. Namely, you play out in a make-believe world what would happen given certain setups, and as a way of kind of expanding your intelligence. You're seeing a whole lot of games and scenarios that you yourself could not have anticipated beforehand. So it kind of increases your stock of appreciation of all the ways in which people could interact. The problem is that when people confuse fiction with fact, such as QAnon and other conspiracy theories, and a question is, why do people tend to blur fiction and fact? And I think part of the answer is that there's a zone that's people treat neither as fiction nor fact. And these are beliefs that they think it is good to hold for one reason or another. Whether they're true or false is almost beside the point. And the way I try to grapple with it, and I even use the Comet Ping Pong Pizza example, the predecessor of QAnon, the idea that there was a conspiracy of Satan worshipping pedophiles. In some versions of the story, they're also cannibalistic, operating in the basement of this pizza. And by the way, I should mention for local relevance, according to one version of the theory, there's actually a tunnel between that pizzeria and the Politics and Prose bookstore. And, I've been told that our hosts this afternoon are occasionally haunted by people who think that the bookstore is part of this cabal. But Hugo Mercier, the psychologist, pointed out that if you really thought that children were being raped in the basement, you should call the police. And very few believers in this theory call the police. There was the guy who burst in with his guns blazing to free the children. And you got to at least give him credit for taking his belief seriously. But most people who believe in these conspiracy theories, it's not clear what that belief consists of. And Mercier mentioned that a typical response is that among some of these people, they left a one-star Yelp review for the pizzeria. And comment like the pizza crust was incredibly underbaked, and some men were looking suspiciously at my son. So do they believe it? And my sense is also was pointed out by the great social psychologist Robert Abelson. There are beliefs that we have that we really treat as testable, realistic hypotheses about the world of cause and effect that we all have to negotiate. How do you keep the food in the fridge? How do you get the kids clothed and fed and off to school on time? There, you can't have crazy beliefs. Otherwise, your fridge will be empty. Your kids will never make it to school. You really have to be in touch with reality. And there's this whole other universe of like what actually goes on in the White House. How did the universe begin? What is the ultimate? Why do some people get struck by illness and others not? Where for most of our history, you couldn't find out. In mythology, that is emboldening beliefs, good stories were all we had to go on anyway. So you might as well believe them if they kind of bind the tribe, if they make you look good and make your enemies look bad, if they confirm your worst suspicions about your enemies, and therefore rile up your side and increase solidarity. And the idea that all of your beliefs should be tested as to whether they're true or false, it's kind of a weird conviction that kind of emerged after the Enlightenment, but isn't the natural human way of believing stuff. at least
Yeah.
not to these realms that are distant from your everyday experience.
Yeah, and I mean, we live in such a fascinating moment when we think about the possibility of testing beliefs, where, now we've got vast troves of data online where people can basically find anything that tests their beliefs, and it's this interesting tension I'm going to ask you to reflect on toward the end, just the end. I want to turn to the question of the evolution of rationality, and just get your thinking about this. And this, I think, in some sense, you cite the work of Tooby and Cosmides, and they're thinking about it, and love to hear your thinking. You cite some ethnographic or kind of qualitative, rich observations of sub-Saharan peoples, and there's a lot of new work now on what you can really, of traditional societies, if you will, indigenous societies, how they approach flora and fauna, and how they gather data, and really are developing, in some sense, pretty sophisticated ways of testing probabilities and truth, and starting to develop a knowledge about this really early in our history. You've thought a lot about the evolution of language, the mind, the passions, how the mind works. It's always been a kind of a deep theme. You've been a leader in this field. How do you think about the evolution of rationality? Does it grow out of the structure of language and what language does, and how we share things together in describing the world? How do you approach it?
Yeah, so I actually begin the book with a discussion of the San of the Kalahari Desert.
Yeah, it's thrilling.
Rely on their inferential abilities to in tracking their prey, because the San practiced persistence hunting, which means they just basically chase the antelope down until the antelope keels over from heat stroke, and then they bash it on the head. You can only, since antelope are a lot faster than humans, but we can run in the sun longer because we're naked, we sweat, we dump heat. They don't. But it all depends on our ability to infer what the animal is, what its condition is, which way it's likely to go from very subtle signs in their tracks. And they are clever scientists in testing hypotheses from data, the data being the tracks. They engage in critical thinking, like they know not to trust their first hunch, but to doubt it and to discuss these hypotheses. They engage in Bayesian reasoning. So if a track could have come from two different animals, but they just know one is more prevalent in the environment, then they'll guess that it must be that animal. So in fact, they don't always neglect base rates.
Right.
A young upstart can criticize a respected elder, so they don't fall for the fallacy of the argument from authority. So the rudiments of rationality really are present in a lifestyle that literally goes back hundreds of thousands of years, and that probably represents the ancestral state of our species, or at least it's close. So I begin that way so that we don't get into the habit of just blaming our irrationality on the hunter-gatherers.
Yeah.
They shouldn't take the blame. They could be plenty
Yeah.
And where language fits in is that language, and this is a major theme in the book, and part of the answer to the question of how we could be so crazy and rational at the same time. Rationality often comes from a kind of social intelligence. That is, we can voice opinions, and then others can criticize them, and we kind of pool our knowledge and refine our knowledge and our expertise by floating ideas and seeing which ones survive criticism. And you can't do that without language. So it's a way of kind of pooling and refining our rationality. And part of and bringing us back up to the 21st century as to why there's so much irrationality around us. The answer isn't so much that individual humans are irrational, though we are, but we've only been able to attain accomplishments of science and democracy and so on by institutions that formalize the way in which we pool and evaluate our ideas, so that one person's irrationality can be spotted by another. And so mechanisms like peer review, editing, fact-checking, open debate, free speech are all implemented by governments and scientific societies and reputable newspapers and so on, so that in all of the rough and tumble of debate and conversation and argument, there is at least some hope that the truth will emerge. But if you have to count on one person to come up with the truth, forget about it. None of us is rational. And language is how we do it.
Really cool. And I'm curious, earlier we talked about how it's interesting that there are certain realms of the news, and we've talked a lot about the news, and it's such a newsworthy time where we seem to be more open to data, testing, statistics, and all these elements of rationality like sports and weather and other realms where we're less open to it. And it's interesting to think in the evolutionary context where, it really comes down to predicting weather and food and sources of protein. We develop pretty sophisticated tendencies towards rationality. In other realms, it's a little bit slippery. You have any thoughts about that? About where we're good at it and where we're not?
Right. And well, certainly we are better at reasoning that's kind of baked together with certain salient subject matters, certain things that we really care about, like obligations and social contracts. Right. Who owes whom what? Who earned what they got? Who is exploiting stuff? Precautions. What's likely to kill you, and what can you do about it? And when you, even in the classic cases of base rate neglect and the kind of fallacies of ignoring base rates, if instead of saying the base rate of cancer in the population is 1%, which people can kind of process that sentence, but it doesn't really sink very deep. You say, imagine 1,000 people, 10 of them have cancer. Then they're actually not so bad at folding in base rates. And so we're better at reasoning when there are concrete particulars that we can manipulate in our mind's eye. And that is the natural way in which we encounter probabilities in the world. It's only recently that the concept of something like probability is x is 0.27. Well, unless you're really numerate, that's a kind of a statement that's likely to whiz over your head. Whereas of the 100 people that I have seen in my life, 27 have had this and the rest have not. I think that's the way we live our lives, and that's what cognition is typically fed by.
Yeah, and for our readers out there, one of the things that Steve does in this book, which is really, it's the first time I've seen it, which is to take a lot of the concepts in Bayesian theories and probabilistic reasoning and visualize them. And it was really illuminating. So Steve, I'm gonna turn to some of our many questions. Are you ready?
Sure am.
All right. So this is from Travis. The book argues that much apparent irrationality is the result of people rationally pursuing goals other than the objective truth. How can we encourage others to keep objective truth as our goal?
Yeah, that's the question. And, it is institutions and forums that actually state that as their goal that often have the best track record of attaining that goal. An example would be Wikipedia, where if you want to contribute to Wikipedia, you look at their 5 pillars, and one of them is we aim for objectivity, viewpoint neutrality, objective truth, and so on. And at least in theory, that's what science and academia claim to be attaining. So you got to, first of all, set it up as, put it out there. It's a good thing. We should all do it.
Yes.
There should be certain norms of reasoning and speaking that should be more kind of common currency, like you shouldn't argue from anecdote, you shouldn't insult the arguer, but zero in on the argument, you shouldn't set a straw man. So there are those kinds of habits. But again, another part of it is you've got to belong to a community that enforces it so that you can't get away with that. Someone will call you on it.
Yeah, well put. And one of the nice things in your book, and I found myself being a little bit embarrassed because I'm vulnerable to these, is these informal fallacies that we often resort to counter arguments. So
really, same here. I mean, we all do it. Yeah. We can stop, well, we all do it. Yes. Right.
I'm curious, and I get this a lot in seminars that I teach at Berkeley. When I say, this is a scientific seminar, we're going to rely on data and statistical inference to arrive at some sense of truth about, about emotion or the mind or happiness, what have, probabilistic truths. And there are always a couple people who are really irritated by the idea of truth. And so how do you approach that person?
yeah, like, because the response is, well, who the hell are you to claim to have the truth? And isn't it dangerous if you claim to the one true truth? And they're right. In fact, the movement called the Truthers are the ones who argue that 9/11 was an inside job, controlled demolition. They call themselves Truthers, which kind of raises your suspicions if someone uses the word truth too much. The answer is that it's true. No one does have the truth. It is an aspiration that you can hope to approach collectively, but that no one has. So the commitment is that there is a truth. I don't know it. You don't know it. Let's try to come as close as possible. That has to be the aspiration, but not an arrogant declaration.
Wonderful. And I love it how it fits within your deeper evolutionary story of truths about collections of individuals trying to make reasonable claims about the world. And, it progresses. Here's a question from Daniel, very much in the spirit of what we've been talking about. How would you recommend that somebody can calmly and effectively convey statistics and data with all of the kind of the emotion of the social justice issues of our time, while not appearing dismissive or arrogant? So how do we use data in this era of kind of deep tensions about social justice issues?
It is a difficult challenge, simply because when you are in the throes of a moral passion, data can seem kind of corrosive, subversive. The psychologist Philip Tetlock, in his work on the psychology of taboo, notes that it's natural to think that certain kinds of base rates, you and I have been talking about base rates, are forbidden. That if you talk about them, then you're part of the problem. And so the whole statistical mindset is itself considered vaguely disreputable in certain kinds of moralistic thinking. I think the best you can do is to say that if your ultimate goal is to do the most good, is to save the most lives, is to reduce racism, is to reduce police killings of unarmed suspects, to make Black Lives Matter, then you can't really do it without statistics, because you might be doing the wrong thing. You might be doing something that you think will save lives, but in fact won't. And so we all share the goal, a number of goals, such as reducing poverty, reducing police shootings, reducing incarceration, reducing crime. Since you can only do it if you have a good understanding of reality, including cause and effect, data and statistics are the only way to accomplish what we all agree we ought to accomplish. So we agree on what's good, but let's all work together to bring it about. That would be a line of argument. I may not have the kind of the political and rhetorical skill to do it myself, but that's what somebody aiming to do it should try to master.
Yeah, the other thing that I would say, and it's such a very timely question, is I always remind audiences when we get to fraud issues that that scientists make mistakes. I love Stephen Jay Gould's Mismeasure of Man, because it kind of talks about the mistakes early social scientists made, and they could measure humans. So it's good to be.
And there are plenty of mistakes that Stephen Jay Gould made too, but that's the way science is. It corrects itself. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a really interesting one, and it's a historical question, which is very. I was going to ask it as well, given that how you've really ventured into certain kinds of history and its relevance to data. Matthew asks, how is it possible that rates of irrationality in some domains of life and society are increasing despite the Flynn effect? And I love his citation of the Flynn effect, that we're getting smarter in many ways. So how do you think about this? How do you think about, this? And I had to say, what do you think?
It is absolutely a poignant question. The Flynn effect, referring to the rise in IQ scores of about 3 points a decade that has taken place for about a century, starting to level off in the countries in which it's gone on the longest. It's not clear that irrationality has increased, but it certainly hasn't decreased, as much as I can tell. And it is a puzzle that is whatever the Flynn effect consists of. It hasn't been pervasive enough to result in, say, a decrease in beliefs in astrology, which, as best I can tell, are kind of flat for 50 years, or of crystal healing power and so on. Now, there's certain, that having been said, there certainly are changes. So you don't have beliefs in omens, in eclipses, and comets, and the astrological beliefs. It's not clear how much people guide their lives by them, even though it is amusing to read your horoscope. So part of it may go back to the idea that we believe certain things for their empowering, emboldening effect, not for their literal truth, and that the high levels of belief in them, therefore, aren't caught by the kind of measures that have increased with the Flynn effect. But the honest answer is that I don't have a ready explanation, and to my own, I think knowing about the Flynn effect, I falsely anticipated that when beliefs in paranormal phenomena were plotted over time, they would show a decrease. And I was flat wrong. They are, the curves are pretty much flat.
Yeah, interesting. Another big question, Steve, and your thinking always generates big questions, which I like, which is asking you to comment about the relationship between rationality and its evolution and religion, and what we're witnessing. And it's interesting. I think the hypothesis could go both directions, which is, at least in Western European countries, we're seeing this decline in participation in formal religions. What do you think about the relationship between adherence to a religious dogma and the rise of rationality, or the rise of irrationality? I think you could advocate both.
Yeah, there are a number of trends going on, and beginning with religion itself, which, for one thing, there are religious beliefs, there are catechisms and dogmas and scriptures, although many of them, I suspect, fall into this second zone of belief that we've been talking about, where people just don't treat them as testable beliefs. That we call them faith, and an often angry reaction to the new atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Dan Dennett has been, well, you're applying scientific criteria to them, but it's not a matter of science. It's kind of uncouth to even raise the question of whether God exists. It's not like a question of whether the Sasquatch exists. It exists in that sense is just not what we're talking about. So they're the religious beliefs that people just don't take as matters of truth and falsity, but rather matters of moral or inspiring things to believe. And also, quite apart from the actual cognitive content of religion, there's the social and institutional aspect, the services and the music and the community and the charity and the social action, and a lot of that can survive, and in fact has survived in many liberal religious denominations, like Reformed Judaism, like many denominations of Protestantism, where it's kind of don't ask, don't tell when it actually comes to the content of belief in miracles and deities, but you're all together for a higher purpose. When it does come to belief, though, that is one area in which there really has been a change, and it may be related to an increase in rationality. Fewer and fewer people sign on to religious beliefs, at least in Western countries. And despite so it's a case where we've got kind of conflicting trends. Because at the same time that the number of nuns, by which I don't mean the women in the habits, but N-O-N-E, the people, when you ask, what's your religion, they say none. Those are the nuns. But especially in younger generations, fewer and fewer people are religiously affiliated. And that surprises people who say, well, I thought religion is getting even more and more prominent. And the reason for this apparent contradiction is, even though more and more people are falling away from religion, religious people have more babies. And so in many countries and many sectors of this country, the number of religious people is increasing simply because religious people of all denominations have more children. The other is that they're better organized. Evangelists vote, humanists and atheists don't. It's a bad situation, but the political influence of religion is outsized compared to the numbers in the population.
Yeah, interesting. Wow. Worth an article sometime. So we only have time for a couple more questions. So I'm going to turn to a couple of more topical ones. One is from Mark, and I had the same question about big data and algorithms and machine learning and deep neural networks. And, we are moving toward, whether we like it or not, a more statistically influenced world in terms of precision healthcare and being exposed to music that fits our musical preferences and the like. And I'm curious what you think about that. In some sense, it's the instantiation of one form of rationality, big data, statistics, et cetera. What's your take on all of that and these developments?
There's several things going on. One of them is that the upside is that in general, and this is one of a classic finding in our field in psychology, that judgments of experts tend to be outperformed by even really simple algorithms. This goes back to the 1950s. You give an expert a few pieces of data, you feed it into a simple equation, and you predict something like, will this patient attempt suicide? Will this suspect jump bail? Will this stock increase? And the formula does better than the person. And that's even before artificial intelligence. So artificial intelligence could, in theory, do way, way better. And if we deploy it toward goals that are good, that we can justify, that promises a big increase in human well-being. So, for example, if in, say, reading tumors from an X-ray, if the algorithms can do it better than the radiologist, that's all to the good. And in predicting other things. There have been criticisms of algorithms, first of all, because they clearly are no better than the data they've been trained on,
Right.
Which is true, and because they can be deployed toward goals that we may legitimately question. Like if the goal is just to get you sucked into a YouTube rabbit hole, the algorithms can be very good at that. They could instead be tuned to exposing you to different viewpoints. Now, whichever they do, they can probably do better than a human judge, but it doesn't absolve us of the decision of what should we be using these algorithms to attain.
Interesting. And I think that your definition of rationality is what are the goals that are being served by these patterns of rationality is really useful there. I suspect this is probably our last question, Steve, and it really dovetails with what I was going to ask you about. And I wanted you to imagine you're teaching 16-year-olds, right? And you have a group of high schoolers, you're going to teach them Rationality, this new book, and the principles of it. And they're facing a complicated world. They're facing just the glut of Instagram. And the anonymous question comes from somebody who says, what is the relationship between populism and then rationality, right? And in your book, you talk about kind of an interesting irony of our times, which is more people are writing, more people are expressing opinions, more people offer medical advice, more people offer climate related, it's just everywhere. So what are some of the kind of key takeaways from rationality for that group of teenagers you're teaching who are heading into a world where hopefully it'll be a little bit more rational?
Yeah, well, some of it is a kind of media literacy of well-grounded skepticism. Don't believe everything you see on Twitter or on Facebook. And it should really be, it is an important component of education, like I guess used to be called civics. How do you become a responsible citizen? And part of it is being better able to weed out the nonsense.
Yeah.
But also I think to take advantage of what we increasingly have that earlier generations did not, and that is data and trends and knowledge about which way the world is going. And I think it does have a constructive pro-social subtext. You mentioned that you ended your course of happiness by talking about positive trends in the world. It isn't to make people just feel good about the world, not that there's anything bad about that, but rather to say that we can improve things. Our ancestors tried, they succeeded. I mean, not perfectly, but they did better. They left a better world than the one that they found. The fact that improvement has taken place is exactly what we need to get the gumption to try to make the world better still. So it's not futile, it's not romantic, it's not utopian, it's not a waste of time. It really can work bit by bit. So, let's do it.
Yeah. Well, Steve, I have been so inspired by your scholarship and your writings and your books and the big ideas that you encourage us to take on in the spirit of rationality. So I wanted to just say how wonderful it's been to be in conversation with you and how much I enjoyed your book. It was a real delight to read.
Thanks, and vice versa, Dacher. And thanks so much for having this conversation. It was great fun.
Me too.
Dacher, great job moderating. And Steve, let's certainly all hope your book leads to a more rational world. You have any thoughts on how, I'm tempted, for instance, to give your book to some people I argue with all the time and wish were more rational. But how do you? And I may offer it as a gift. But how do you do that without someone taking offense? You think they're irrational. Any suggestions for that?
You're right. It's like giving someone a jar of mouthwash. It's kind of you might find this useful. I tend to hope. I hope not. I think it's you could frame it as just like who isn't interested.
Right. Yeah. Well, I think maybe I'll just say, hey, here's a great book.
Here's a great book. I'll recommend that.
Right. So to everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of Rationality. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well.